Don Andres' mansion, resplendent like a jewel beneath the light of crystal chandeliers, vibrated with the energy of a party that seemed to defy the stars themselves. The air was filled with the sweet scent of freshly cut garden flowers, and the clinking of crystal glasses filled the room with an almost hypnotic music. Throughout the halls, elegantly dressed figures moved gracefully, as if part of a carefully choreographed dance. Laughter echoed off the walls, mingling with the soft sound of the piano, which, in the background, drew melodies that seemed to touch the hearts of those present. Meanwhile, at the center of all this splendor stood Pedro, Don Andres' young heir, enveloped by an aura of expectation and responsibility that weighed heavily on his shoulders. His smile was as impeccable as his tuxedo, but in his eyes there was a restless glint, a shadow of doubt he couldn't dispel. "Am I up to all this?" he wondered internally as he warmly greeted the guests. The weight of his family's legacy seemed increasingly unbearable, an invisible current pulling him toward an abyss of uncertainty. In a corner of Pedro's mind, a buzzing sound grew, a dizzying sensation he tried to ignore. But the feeling of suffocation, intensified by the heat of the lights and the incessant murmur of voices, became increasingly impossible to ignore. His heart pounded wildly, as if trying to escape his chest. He put his hand to his forehead, trying to mask the discomfort that now threatened to overflow. "I need air. I need to get out of here," he thought, his smile becoming more rigid, almost a mask. Suddenly, the world around him began to spin. The guests' voices became distant, as if coming from another universe. Pedro's eyes, once bright, were now clouded, lost in a void of shadows. The ground seemed to give way beneath his feet. And then, as if time had stopped for an eternal instant, he fell, gravity pulling him downward with relentless force. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by an almost palpable silence that seemed to freeze time. Don Andres, who had been watching everything closely, felt his heart stop for a second. His firstborn, his pride and joy, was now lying inert on the floor. His mind was buzzing with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "No, it can't be," he murmured, his feet seemingly glued to the floor. The world he had so painstakingly built threatened to crumble before his eyes. The shocked guests formed a circle around Pedro, their faces reflecting a mixture of horror and compassion. Meanwhile, the maid Clara, a discreet figure with a discerning gaze, watched the scene from afar, her heart pounding in unison with the tension that gripped the room. Something deep inside her told her that this moment would change everything. "There is something I can do," she thought, as a silent determination began to take shape within her. What Clara knew, that no one else knew, was that she held a secret, an ancient knowledge that could be the key to saving Pedro. And so, with a resolve that only desperation can inspire, Clara began to move, determined to change the fate that seemed so implacable. The scene was set, the stage ready for a story no one could have predicted to unfold. What had been glamorous about the party was now tragic. And while time seemed to hesitate, Pedro's fate hung by a thread, awaiting the miraculous healing touch that only Clara could provide. The clock on the living room wall seemed to have stopped, though its insistent ticking echoed like a continuous hammering, piercing the silence that fell over the mansion. The opulent decor, with its sparkling chandeliers and fine wood furniture, seemed to have lost its luster, overshadowed by the shadow of despair that loomed large. The soft scent of fresh flowers, arranged in carefully planned arrangements, was now barely perceptible against the tension that suffocated the air. The eyes of Roberto, Pedro's father, were fixed on the doctor who had just delivered the devastating news. His face, normally pale and serene, was now flushed with shock and disbelief. He could barely process the words that had come from the doctor's mouth. 1 hour, just 1 hour, echoed incessantly in his mind, like a funeral bell announcing an inevitable tragedy. He felt his legs weaken, but he managed to stand firm, out of pure survival instinct. "It can't be, not my son," he thought, as a wave of despair threatened to break the dam of his composure. Beside him, Sofia, Pedro's mother, clutched her hands so tightly that her knuckles were white. Her body trembled slightly, as if consumed by an internal chill. Her eyes were wide, a mixture of panic and disbelief in them, as her mind desperately tried to cling to some hope, however small. There must be a mistake, they'll find a solution. She repeated to herself, almost like a mantra, but the cruel reality was inescapable. The doctor, Dr. Leonardo, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a usually calm and confident demeanor, now seemed small and powerless in the face of the situation. He never liked to be the bearer of bad news, but this was particularly painful. "We did everything we could," he said, his voice filled with genuine regret, his eyes avoiding direct contact with his parents. "Pedro's condition is extremely rare. His body is failing, and we can't pinpoint the exact cause." At the door of the room, Clara watched the scene with her heart pounding. Each word the doctor said was like a dagger, piercing her conscience. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. The urgency of her mission was now undeniable. Her thoughts were in turmoil, but one certainty was beginning to emerge: she had to act. "I can't let this happen," she thought, her eyes, once filled with dread, now shining with fierce determination. The silence in the room was broken only by Sophia's muffled sobs, as she nearly sank into Roberto's arms, seeking comfort and strength. The weight of the moment seemed to have created a time bubble, where seconds dragged on like hours. And in this atmosphere charged with pain and helplessness, Clara took a deep breath, inhaling the subtle scent of lavender that had always soothed her. It was now or never. As the clock continued its inexorable march, Clara stepped forward, breaking the hesitant murmur that had settled. "I can help," she said, her voice firm but filled with emotion. All eyes turned to her, some in disbelief, others hopeful. And in that moment, with Pedro's fate hanging precariously in the balance, Clara's promise shone like a spark of hope amid the darkness. The next step, she thought, would be crucial. In the recesses of the mansion, a discreet presence observed the harrowing scene unfolding in the main room. Marisa, the family's devoted maid, watched the drama with a heavy heart, as if she felt Sophia and Roberto's pain firsthand. The air was saturated with despair, an almost palpable sensation that pressed against her chest like an invisible hand. Marisa, with her watchful eyes and a heart full of compassion, could not look away from the desolate scene before her. She was a figure of quiet strength, a woman whose entire life had been dedicated to caring for others. And there, amidst that emotional storm, an old memory began to emerge from the depths of her memory. The image of her grandmother, a wise woman full of mysteries, appeared in her mind like a vision. Marisa could almost feel the heat of her grandmother's wood-burning stove, hear the crackle of the flames as she mixed herbs with experienced and patient hands. "Every plant has a voice," her grandmother would say, a mantra that echoed now with deafening clarity. Marisa walked away from the room, feeling a growing urgency in her steps. The hallway was bathed in soft light filtering through the tall windows, and the sound of her footsteps echoed softly, as if time itself were suspended, awaiting her decision. In the back of her mind, a small flame of hope began to burn, fueled by memories of the healing stories her grandmother had shared. Those were stories of times gone by, when modern science had not yet completely silenced the voices of nature. Arriving at the small room she shared with other maids, Marisa knelt beside an old, worn-out trunk. The hinges creaked in protest as they were opened, but she ignored the sound, immersed in a search for something she knew was there. Her hand ran over a thick linen cloth and finally found a small cloth bag. As she opened it, the scent of dried herbs wafted into the air, an earthy blend that evoked memories of sunny afternoons in the countryside, gathering plants with her grandmother. Holding the bag, Marisa closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel her grandmother's comforting presence beside her. "You always knew what to do, Grandma," he whispered, a single tear rolling down his cheek. She felt a renewed determination blossom within her, a certainty that perhaps this ancient knowledge could be the key to changing Pedro's fate. She knew that faith in those herbs was something only she possessed at that moment, but she was willing to risk everything to bring a ray of hope to the family she loved so much. Standing up, the bag of herbs tightly clutched in her hands, Marisa took a deep breath. She knew she needed to be quick, but also careful. Time was a luxury they didn't have, but hope still shone like a lone star amidst the darkness. And with her grandmother's promise guiding her steps, Marisa headed back to the living room, determined to share her secret, ready to fight against disbelief and despair. With each step, her resolve grew, a silent march against the fate that seemed sealed. And so, the stage was set for the next act of a story that would never be forgotten. Marisa crossed the room like a silent storm, her every step reverberating with the intensity of her determination. The room was permeated with the suffocating scent of incense, burned incessantly by the family in a desperate attempt to purify the air and summon some kind of miracle. The walls, adorned with family portraits, seemed to watch her critically, silent witnesses to her boldness. Don Andres' face, still marked by disbelief and weariness, slowly turned toward her as she entered. His eyes, two deep brown spheres, were weary, half-closed in a mixture of exhaustion and skepticism. He sat, his shoulders slumped under the weight of a world that seemed to have collapsed upon him. "What do you think you're going to do, Marisa?" he asked, his voice filled with a sharp disbelief that pierced the air like a blade. The young woman hesitated for a brief second, feeling the blow of his words. But then, like a flame that refuses to go out, she lifted her chin, her eyes shining with fierce determination. "I will save Pedro, even if you don't believe me," she replied, with a firmness that defied doubt. Don Andres' contempt was like a shadow hanging between them, but Marisa, guided by the memory of her grandmother and the promises whispered on starry nights, was undeterred. She could feel her heart drumming in her chest, each beat a constant reminder of the urgency driving her. She knew Don Andres' disbelief was not irrational. He was an educated man, shaped by years of science and logic, and to him, the idea that a handful of herbs could save his son's life sounded more like a fairy tale than a viable solution. But Marisa had seen miracles happen before, small and insignificant, but real nonetheless. And, though her eyes were filled with weariness, they were also filled with hope. Her lips pressed into a thin line of determination, Marisa turned away, ignoring Don Andres' disapproving gaze. She knew that not being able to count on his support made her task even more difficult, but the possibility of failure had never stopped her before. With trembling but steady hands, she began to prepare the mixture. Each leaf of herb was meticulously crushed, releasing a pungent aroma that filled the air, a perfume of ancient promises. "This is madness, Marisa," Don Andres insisted, his voice now tinged with a desperation he could no longer hide. "What you feel, it won't change anything." Marisa didn't respond immediately. Instead, she absorbed his words, letting them settle in her chest like a stone. Then, slowly, she raised her eyes to his, her own orbs shining with an almost supernatural intensity. "It may be madness," she admitted, her voice a whisper laden with emotion, "but sometimes, madness is all we have left when hope seems lost." And with that declaration, she turned back to her task, her mind teeming with memories of her grandmother, who had always told her that the human heart is stronger than any poison. Marisa knew she had only one chance, but as she worked, she felt an unexpected peace wash over her. Because, even in the face of disbelief and scorn, she was doing what her heart believed was right. And in the silence of that room, with time running out, Marisa understood that sometimes, faith is the only anchor in a sea of uncertainty. The weight of her commitment was as palpable as the heat of the fire she kept burning, and although the future remained uncertain, she was prepared to fight until her last breath. Marisa took a deep breath before crossing the threshold into the kitchen, a space that pulsed like the heart of the house with its frenetic and constant activity, a haven of aromas of fresh herbs and exotic spices that danced in the air like notes of an invisible symphony. The clinking of cutlery, the hissing of pots, and the bubbling of cauldrons created a cacophony that masked the tension underlying her secret objective. She knew exactly what she needed, those special ingredients her grandmother had mentioned, the legacy of generations hidden in recipes the modern world had forgotten. But she wasn't alone. Roberto, the head chef, had eyes like beacons of suspicion, fixed on her with every movement. His face, stern and impassive, resembled a marble mask, but Marisa could feel the heat of suspicion emanating from him. "You shouldn't be here, Marisa," he declared, his voice rough as sandpaper, each word laden with an authority that seemed to crush her hopes. Get back to your duties before Miss Helena notices your absence." Marisa felt her heart sink, like a ship hit by a giant wave of anxiety. But her indomitable spirit was not easily wavered. "Roberto, I need some ingredients," she began, her voice trembling slightly, but soon finding its firmness. "It's for the little boss. I know what I'm doing." Roberto raised a skeptical eyebrow as he crossed his arms defensively. "What do you know that the doctors don't, huh? Think you can do more than them?" The doubt in his voice was palpable, a barrier of ice between them. The other employees, Sophia and David, stopped to listen, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Marisa felt the weight of the collective judgment, but there was something more powerful within her, a flame of determination that would not be easily extinguished. "My grandmother, she taught me some things," she replied, almost in a whisper, but her words carried the strength of an ancient promise. "Please, I just need a chance." The silence that followed was oppressive, thick with tension and anticipation. Marisa felt Sophia's gaze soften, a flicker of empathy crossing her brown eyes. "Maybe we should let her try, Roberto. What do we have to lose?" Sophia asked, her voice soft as a balm. Roberto's resistance began to waver under the weight of Sophia's insistence and Marisa's imploring gaze. He let out a heavy sigh, as if releasing a burden of doubt. "Very well," he finally relented, his eyes still narrowed with caution. "But you will be responsible for any disaster, understand?" Marisa nodded, hope blossoming in her chest like a flower in spring. She knew time was her enemy, but now she had a chance, and she wouldn't waste it. As she began gathering the ingredients, she felt adrenaline pulse through her veins, an electric current of hope and fear. Deep down, while the employee's eyes still followed her, she knew she would face more challenges, but she also knew that each step she took to save her heir was a step closer to proving that the power of the heart and ancient traditions could overcome any obstacle. And so, with the ingredients in hand and her faith renewed, Marisa prepared to face the next challenge, determined to turn doubt into a miracle. Marisa, with the ingredients carefully stored in a worn cloth bag, hurried down the marble staircase of the old mansion, her heart pounding in sync with her hurried steps. The air was heavy with the sweet scent of the magnolias that lined the path, a fragrance that seemed to mock the gravity of the situation. She had a mission she could not fail, and every second was crucial. As her feet carried her toward her destination, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and silent prayers. It was then, as she turned the corner of the narrow, dimly lit hallway, that she collided with a robust figure. The papers she was holding scattered across the floor like autumn leaves in the wind. Marisa took a step back, her heart pounding, and looked up to find Evandro, the family lawyer, a man whose name was synonymous with distrust among the employees. His small, shrewd eyes stared at her from behind gold-rimmed glasses, a glint of irritation, and something else, something darker, danced within them. "Marisa, always in such a hurry," he murmured, his voice as slick as oil on a wet floor. Evandro bent down, gathering the documents with calculated calm. Each piece of paper seemed like a brick in the wall of his insidious plans. Marisa instinctively took another step back, feeling the cool marble against her heels. "Are you going somewhere important?" he asked, his smile reaching his eyes. She hesitated, her mind racing, searching for words that wouldn't reveal her true intentions. "Yes, Mr. Evandro, I'm going to help in the kitchen." "There's a lot to be done," she lied, trying to keep her voice steady. But the lawyer, with his keen perception, seemed to sniff out the lie in the air, like a predator searching for prey. "I hope what you're doing doesn't delay the family's plans. We have delicate matters to resolve. You know how it is," he said, arranging the papers against his chest and looking down at her, as if she were a tiny piece in his chess game. Marisa felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that Evandro, always with an eye on his ambitions, might not want Pedro to survive. After all, the young heir's death could open doors of opportunity for him, doors that had been closed for a long time. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the room itself was holding its breath in the face of the veiled confrontation. Marisa knew she needed to escape that oppressive presence before its intentions became clear. "Of course, Mr. Evandro, I'll do my best not to get in the way," she replied with a forced smile, desperately trying to maintain her composure. As she passed him, she felt the lawyer's gaze boring into her back, as if he could see right through her, right into her soul. Marisa clutched her bag to her chest like a shield and continued on her way. Each step echoed through the halls like a warning drumbeat. Evandro's invisible threat loomed over her, but Marisa knew she couldn't afford to falter. Pedro's life depended on the courage she could muster, on the unshakable faith that ancient traditions could triumph over greed and malice. With her heart beating like a metronome, she pressed on, determined to turn what could have been a goodbye into a new beginning. And as the last echo of Evandro's footsteps faded into the distance, Marisa knew the real battle was just beginning. In the cold, austere corridors of the hospital, Evandro walked with measured steps, the sound of his shoes echoing softly against the white walls. His eyes, two slits of cunning, watched Marisa's every move attentively. Something about her intrigued him deeply. Was it simply the determination of a desperate woman? Or was there more behind that gaze that defied adversity? He couldn't afford to underestimate her. He sensed Marisa knew more than she let on, and he was determined to find out. The atmosphere was permeated by a sterile smell, mixed with the subtle fragrance of disinfectant, common in hospitals. This aroma, which to others would be a mere detail, was for Evandro a constant reminder that within these walls, a life-and-death battle was taking place. Pedro, the heir he had so despised, had now become a vital part of his plans. And Marisa, that simple maid, was proving to be a potential obstacle. He needed to know how far she was willing to go. Pausing for a moment, Evandro leaned against the cold wall, surreptitiously observing the movement around him. The room was bustling, nurses and doctors hurried about, but to him, time seemed to have slowed down. His mind was focused on Marisa, on her every gesture and expression. When he saw her hesitate momentarily in front of a door, his eyes shone with insatiable curiosity. "What is she hiding?" he thought, feeling a shiver of anticipation run down his spine. Marisa, for her part, felt like prey in the sights of a predator. Evandro's presence was oppressive, but she couldn't give in to fear. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind, "Courage is the weapon of those who have no other choice." She needed to believe that, amidst so much darkness, her mission would bring the light she so desperately sought. With a deep sigh, she opened the door and entered a small waiting room, where dim lights cast dancing shadows on the walls. Evandro, moving with the dexterity of a feline, followed her, staying out of sight but always alert. The room, filled with the faint aroma of stale coffee, was nearly deserted. Only an old television in the corner displayed silent news footage, its flickering light illuminating Marisa's tense face. He noticed how she sat, rubbing her hands nervously, as if trying to warm the frozen courage within her. Her eyes, fixed on the cell phone in her lap, reflected an unwavering determination. The tension in the air was palpable. Evandro knew he needed to act with surgical precision. His every move had to be meticulously calculated to avoid arousing suspicion. He approached the door, leaning in slightly to listen better. The rapid, irregular beat of Marisa's heart could almost be heard through the thin wood. She had no idea she was being watched, that every second was a dance of life and death for her beloved Pedro. When Marisa's phone finally vibrated, breaking the heavy silence, she jumped, her heart nearly stopping. With trembling fingers, she answered, her voice a whisper filled with hope and fear. "Yes, I found it. I think there's still a chance." Those words, spoken almost in desperation, lit a spark of victory in Evandro's eyes. He knew he was on the right path. The key to Pedro's survival, and perhaps to his own triumph, might lie in those words spoken by Marisa. But as he silently walked away, one question lingered in his mind: how far was she willing to go for those she loved? The atmosphere was saturated with mystery and anticipation. Evandro felt like his every move could tip the scales. Yes, the game was just beginning, and he was determined to win at any cost. But no matter how much he planned, something deep inside him told him that underestimating Marisa could be his biggest mistake. A shadow of doubt lingered in his heart, and he knew he would need all his cunning to avoid being surprised. As he walked away, determined to carry out his plan, a single certainty remained: the real battle was just beginning. The wind blew softly through the trees, carrying with it the earthy scent of damp leaves and wildflowers. Marisa, her heart pounding and her mind teeming with questions, walked hesitantly along the narrow path that led to the hut of Dona Clara, the healer whose name was whispered reverently throughout the village. The surrounding trees seemed to lean forward, as if listening to the sigh of the forest, complicit in the mystery that shrouded this place. The sound of branches breaking beneath her feet echoed in her ears, and each step seemed heavier than the last, as if she carried the weight of the young heir's fate on her shoulders. Marisa felt a cold sweat trickle down the back of her neck, uncertainty tightening her chest. Am I doing the right thing? She wondered, her thoughts jumbled together in a tangle of hope and despair. What if there's no cure? What if all this is in vain? But the determination in her eyes was unwavering, a fire that burned brighter with each new doubt. Evandro's face, with its skeptical and disdainful look, came to mind, fueling her motivation. She needed to prove that faith in something greater, in something that transcended conventional medicine, could be the key to her fading life. Arriving at the cabin, a humble structure made of weathered wood covered in moss, Marisa felt a strange warmth envelop her, as if the cabin itself were welcoming her. Dona Clara, an elderly woman with eyes as piercing as the night, was waiting for her at the door. There was a serenity in her wrinkled face, a wisdom that time had not been able to erase. "Come in, my daughter," she said in a voice that was at once gentle and powerful, like the flow of an ancient river. Inside the hut, the scent of dried herbs and burning resins hung in the air, creating an atmosphere of mysticism. The walls were adorned with amulets and hanging plants, and in the center was a table laden with jars, each containing secrets of nature. Marisa, her hands trembling and her heart pounding, explained her dilemma. Dona Clara listened attentively, her eyes fixed on Marisa's, as if seeking to see beyond the words, penetrating the very depths of her soul. "My dear," Dona Clara began, her voice filled with empathy and understanding, "true healing lies not only in the hands of doctors, but in the connection between body and spirit. Faith is the bridge that unites the visible with the invisible." Marisa felt a shiver run down her spine, a feeling that perhaps she was about to uncover something that would change everything. The healer began to teach her about the herbs, their properties, and the importance of the ritual that was to be performed. Marisa listened attentively, absorbing each word as if it were a prayer. Her mind quieted, finding renewed focus, a certainty that could not be shaken. There, in that sacred space, she felt a spark of hope rekindled. As the sun began to set, dyeing the sky fiery and gold, Marisa left the cabin with new determination. She knew the road ahead would be arduous, but with Dona Clara's wisdom as her guide, she was willing to defy whatever it took. The young heir's destiny was now intertwined with her own path, and she would not rest until she saw life triumph over the shadow of death. As she walked away, a conviction grew in her chest. The real battle was not just against time, but against the disbelief that threatened to extinguish the light of hope. And with this certainty, Marisa knew she was ready for any challenge fate had in store for her. With her heart beating rapidly, Marisa advanced through the dense forest trails, guided by Dona Clara's instructions. The wise old woman, with her firm voice and penetrating gaze, had entrusted Marisa with the task of gathering the precious ingredients that, according to an ancient tradition, might be the only hope of saving young Pedro. With every step, Marisa felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, and the urgency of the mission accelerated her heart. The forest at dusk was a spectacle of shadows and lights, where birdsong mingled with the whisper of the wind through the trees. But in an instant, the sky, which until then had begun to take on the soft hues of twilight, was covered in dark, threatening clouds, as if fate itself were defying their will. The air, once calm and fresh, now carried the pungent scent of wet earth, a harbinger of what was to come. Suddenly, thunder resounded like an ancient roar, making the leaves tremble and Marisa's skin prickle. Heavy rain began to fall, thick drops pelting her face like tears from a dying sky. Feeling the cold seep through her soaked clothes, Marisa hesitated for a brief moment, fighting the urge to seek shelter. But then, the image of Pedro, fragile and defenseless, came to her mind like a beacon in the storm, rekindling her courage. With determined steps, she walked deeper into the forest, her eyes desperately searching for the plants and roots Dona Clara had so carefully described. Every leaf, every flower seemed to hide a world of secrets that only an attentive and experienced mind could decipher. Water ran down her hair, and her fingers trembled, but Marisa was undeterred. "I'll find everything, Pedro. I promise," she murmured to herself, her words lost in the sound of the rain. As she explored the treacherous terrain, the mud threatened to ensnare her, making every step a battle against nature itself. The howling wind seemed to laugh at her efforts, but Marisa, with a determination that defied logic, collected every precious element: the leaves of the Pau Santo tree, the golden flower of the Ipe tree, the twisted roots of the vine. With each discovery, renewed hope ignited her spirit, like small candles lit amidst the darkness. The storm, in its blind fury, seemed to intensify its strength, as if testing the young woman's mettle in her impossible mission. And as the world around her crumbled into chaos, Marisa understood that the real battle was not just against the elements, but against the despair that threatened to engulf her heart. "You are stronger than you think," Dona Clara's voice echoed in her memory, like a mantra, an anchor in the midst of the storm. Finally, with her hands full of natural treasures, Marisa made her way back, each step more confident than the last. The storm, though still fierce, seemed to bow to her determination, as if recognizing the strength of a woman guided by love and faith. And as she approached Dona Clara's hut, a shy ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating her path like a harbinger of hope. With the sight of the cabin ahead, Marisa paused for a moment, allowing herself a deep sigh. "We did it," she thought, her heart warmed by the victory over adversity. However, as she crossed the threshold, one question remained: would Dona Clara's healing be enough to defeat time and death? This doubt, though persistent, only strengthened her determination. Pedro's future depended on her, and with that certainty, Marisa knew she was ready to face whatever came. Inside Dona Clara's hut, the atmosphere was an amalgam of earthy and herbal odors, an almost mystical fragrance that seemed to promise healing. The air was permeated with the essence of dried herbs that hung from the ceiling beams and swayed gently in time with the whispering wind outside. Marisa, her hands still trembling from the journey, began gathering the ingredients Dona Clara had carefully enumerated, each carrying the weight of hope. The herbs were laid out on a rustic table, and Marisa, with a mixture of anxiety and determination, began to mix them, her hands moving with silent, reverent precision. The sound of the pestle against the mortar echoed in the small space, creating an almost hypnotic rhythm that contrasted with the tumult in her chest. With each blow, Marisa felt closer to her goal, as if each grain ground was a step toward Pedro's salvation. "He will live," she repeated to herself, like a silent mantra, as the aromas mingled and intensified, creating a symphony of hope. However, her thoughts were abruptly interrupted by the sudden sound of the door being flung open. Evandro, the family lawyer, stormed into the cabin, his face a mask of anger and indignation. "What do you think you're doing, Marisa?" he bellowed, his voice resounding like thunder in the stillness of the room. His gaze was sharp, and the tension in his shoulders indicated he was prepared for a confrontation. Marisa, surprised, dropped the pestle, which rolled across the table until it landed on the wooden floor, her heart leaping into her throat. "Evandro, I'm trying to save Pedro." Her voice came out in a trembling whisper, but firm, despite the fear that now danced in her eyes. "Save? Or poison?" Evandro snapped, his eyes flashing with a mixture of suspicion and anger. "Do you think I don't know your intentions? Do you think you can come here and blackmail the family with those witches' potions?" His accusatory tone was like a dagger, and Marisa felt hurt, not just by the words, but by the implication that her love and dedication could be misinterpreted in such a way. "Evandro, no," she exclaimed, stepping forward, her gaze fixed on his, begging for understanding. "I would never do anything to hurt Pedro, he's like a son to me." But Evandro, guided by his own prejudices and a blind loyalty to his family, was blind to the sincerity in Marisa's eyes. He crossed his arms, trying to create a barrier between them, both physical and emotional. "You say that now, but how can we trust you? This is a dangerous game, Marisa, and I won't let you play with Pedro's life." The accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as Marisa struggled to maintain her composure in the face of the attack. Deep in her heart, a flame of anger began to burn, fueled by the injustice of the situation. She knew she had to be strong, not just for Pedro, but for herself. Her voice choked but determined, she replied, "Do what you want, Evandro. But know that this concoction is our only hope, and I won't give up until Pedro is out of danger." The silence that followed was palpable, laden with misunderstandings and unspoken emotions, a pause that seemed to stretch on forever. Evandro, however unyielding his stance, couldn't help but recognize the truth in Marisa's determination. Something shifted in his gaze, a momentary doubt, perhaps, as he pondered the intensity of the devotion he saw before him. The scene was set, and the tension was almost tangible, a rope stretched to its limit, about to snap. Marisa knew she needed to find a way to make Evandro see beyond his prejudices, for Pedro's time was running out. And as the wind blew outside, carrying with it whispers of an uncertain fate, only one certainty remained: Pedro's future was at stake, and the battle for his life was just beginning. Marisa left Evandro's office with her shoulders hunched under the weight of disillusionment, as if each step down the mansion's long hallway sapped a little more of her hope. The ancient walls, adorned with tapestries that told the family's history, seemed to whisper silent judgments, reflecting the grandeur of a lineage that now seemed to crumble before the inevitability of Pedro's fate. The mansion's familiar scent of polished wood mixed with a hint of lavender couldn't calm the turmoil in her heart. Tears trailed down Marisa's face, each drop carrying with it the pain of a lost battle. Why can't he see, she thought, the salty taste of tears insisting on touching her lips? The memory of Evandro's hard gaze, inflexible and blind to the truth, pierced her mind like a dagger. Arriving at the door to the office of Don Julio, the family patriarch, Marisa hesitated for a moment. She felt like an intruder in this world of opulence, but the image of Pedro, so frail, lying in his bed, urged her on. It was now or never. With a deep sigh, she knocked on the door, a hollow sound echoing off the heavy wood. "Come in, Marisa," Don Julio's deep voice rang out from the other side, welcoming but carrying an unmistakable authority. Crossing the threshold, Marisa found the elderly gentleman sitting in his leather armchair, his wise, weary eyes fixed on her, as if he already knew what was coming. Don Julio, with his silver hair and imposing presence, was a man accustomed to carrying the weight of difficult decisions. His expression, however, softened when he saw the anguish etched on Marisa's face. The air there was thick, permeated with the scent of cigars and old books, a mixture that had always brought her comfort but now seemed to suffocate her. "Don Julio, I need to talk about Pedro," Marisa began, her voice choked but determined. The words came out quickly, as if she feared her courage would slip away. "I know this may sound absurd, but I know a cure. Something that can save Pedro. I know it sounds crazy, but..." She paused, her inner dilemma evident in her teary eyes. "Evandro doesn't believe me, but I need you to listen to me. Please." Don Julio, who had been listening silently, leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He was not a man of easy emotions, but there was something in Marisa's desperate sincerity that touched a long-forgotten chord in his heart. "Marisa," he said with a softness that surprised even himself, "I've always considered you part of this family. Tell me, what is this cure?" Relief washed over Marisa like a wave, but the responsibility weighed even more heavily. With a trembling but firm voice, she revealed the secret of an ancient home remedy, a recipe passed down through generations in her family. It's an herbal infusion, something my grandmother used for illnesses doctors couldn't cure. I know it's a slim chance, but it's a chance. Don Julio listened to every word, weighing the implications. The silence that followed was thick, charged with expectation. "Marisa," he finally said, his voice a deep whisper, "I believe you. Let's try, for Pedro's sake. Hope dies last." Marisa felt a breath of hope rekindle within her, like a timid flame amid the darkness. She knew the battle was just beginning, but she was no longer alone. There, in that room steeped in stories and promises, an unexpected alliance had been formed. Together, perhaps they could win the race against time and change little Pedro's destiny. In the opulent library of the Montenegro mansion, the walls adorned with mahogany bookshelves filled with ancient volumes exuded a woody scent, mingled with the gentle scent of forgotten incense on the fireplace. Sunlight filtered through burgundy velvet curtains created a dim ambience, casting shadows that danced in the wind across the half-open windows. There, Don Julio and Don Andres faced each other, like titans about to collide. Don Julio, his face lined with the wrinkles of wisdom and time, stood firm, but within him, a whirlwind of emotions was unfolding. There was a weight in his chest, an urgency that made him feel every beat of his heart like a war drum. "Andres," he began, his voice heavy with gravity and hope, "we have one chance only, with Marisa." Don Andres, his eyes darkened by despair and exhaustion, remained motionless, a statue of disbelief. His shoulders hunched under the weight of a world that seemed to be crumbling. He shook his head slowly, as if trying to dispel reality. "Julio, how can I trust something so unlikely? Unbearable tea. Is this what my son's life is all about?" Don Andres' voice sounded brittle, each word a lament that reverberated in the room. He closed his eyes for a moment, searching the void for an answer that never came. The scent of incense seemed to suffocate him, mingling with the bitter taste of impotence. "Sometimes," Don Julio replied, taking a step closer, "hope hides where we least expect it. Marisa believes in that, and I believe in her. It's not just a medicine, but a faith that we challenge every day. You, more than anyone, know what it's like to fight the impossible." Don Andres opened his eyes, staring into Julio's, searching for a spark of certainty. The shadow of a sad smile curved his lips. "What if we fail? What if this is just a delusion, a vain hope? If we don't try," Don Julio replied, his voice now a firm whisper, "we'll already have failed. But if we try, maybe, just maybe, we can find a way out." The silence that followed was heavy, a pause filled with choices. Outside, the wind whispered through the leaves, as if nature itself awaited Don Andres' decision. He took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air fill his lungs, a contrast to the suffocating incense. "Julio," he finally said, each word a struggle against fear, "for Pedro, for my son. I will accept. But know that my heart still hesitates." The tension in the room eased for a moment, as if a taut rope had finally loosened. Don Julio nodded, understanding that the real battle was yet to come. But in that moment, a small victory had been achieved. They were not alone, together, they would face the unknown. With one last look at his friend, Don Julio turned, determined to gather Marisa and the ingredients for the miraculous infusion. As he left the library, the sound of his footsteps echoed like a drumbeat of hope on the wooden floor. Don Andres stood alone, staring out the window where the sun was beginning to set, tinging the sky golden. His thoughts were a mix of fear and anticipation, an internal battlefield where reason and emotion fought endlessly. And so, amid the lengthening shadows, the decision had been made. Little Pedro's fate was now in the hands of a young maid and a father who, though hesitant, chose to believe. Night had already descended upon the Montenegro family's grand mansion, shrouding it in a shroud of mystery and tension. The stars peeked timidly through the clouds that slowly crept across the sky, silent witnesses to the events unfolding below. Marisa, the young maid with the determined gaze and gentle heart, moved quickly through the dark corridors, her mind buzzing with the urgency of her mission. Each step was guided by an almost palpable hope, a light shining amidst the darkness of her uncertainty. But the tranquility of the night was abruptly shattered by the sound of firm, determined footsteps, echoing with a menacing cadence. It was Evandro, the Montenegro family's lawyer, whose reputation for cunning and unscrupulousness preceded him. His face was etched with a cold disdain, and his eyes shone with sinister determination. He knew a secret that, if revealed, could put an end to the legacy he so cherished. And Marisa, with her miraculous infusion, was a threat he could not ignore. Evandro found Marisa in the backyard, where the scents of night flowers mingled in the air with an almost intoxicating sweetness. He approached her, his presence casting a shadow over the serenity of the moment. "Marisa, you can't do this," he said, his voice thick with an authority that tried to mask his desperation. "The stakes here are far greater than you can imagine." Marisa, though frightened, didn't back down. She knew what she held in her hands was little Pedro's last hope. "Evandro, I can't give up." "Not when a child's life depends on it," she replied, her voice trembling but firm. The wind whispered through the leaves, as if nature itself were on her side. Before Evandro could respond, a new figure emerged from the shadows. Clara, Don Andres' sister, with a steely gaze and a posture that exuded unquestionable authority. Her eyes fixed on Evandro with an intensity that could pierce the hardest of hearts. "Evandro, if you continue this, I will have no choice but to reveal everything I know," she threatened, her voice low but filled with a certainty that could not be challenged. Evandro shuddered, the blood draining from his face at those words. He knew Clara wasn't bluffing. The secrets she kept were enough to destroy not only his career, but his life as well. "Clara, you wouldn't do that," he tried to argue, but his tone held more pleading than conviction. "Oh, but I would," Clara replied without hesitation. "If it means protecting the only chance of saving little Pedro, I will go all the way." The garden, now in a tense silence, seemed to breathe along with the three protagonists of that critical moment. Evandro, realizing he was cornered, took a step back. Fear and frustration mingled in his chest, but he knew that, for now, he had no choice but to retreat. Marisa, feeling the tension dissipate, took a deep breath of relief. Clara nodded to her, a silent gesture of complicity and support. The young maid knew the road ahead was still long and dangerous, but for now, a battle had been won. And so, with her heart renewed by hope and unexpected solidarity, Marisa prepared to continue her mission, knowing she was not alone on this journey full of uncertainty. The wind gently caressed the trees, as if the night itself were applauding the courage and determination of those who dared to defy fate. And as Evandro retreated, defeated, Clara and Marisa remained side by side, ready to face together the challenge that tomorrow would bring. The mansion was plunged into an almost palpable stillness, broken only by the soft sound of leaves rustling in the wind outside. Don Andres sat in his study, surrounded by dark mahogany furniture and shelves filled with ancient volumes that told the stories of his lineage. But tonight, his attention was not focused on the stories of the past, but on the faint glow of his computer screen. The video began quietly, with a soft hiss that soon faded into the shaky image of a home camera. There was Pedro, his son, small, perhaps 7 years old, his eyes shining with innocence and wonder. Don Andres held his breath, his heart sinking as the image of the boy appeared, with his dark curls and dazzling smile. "Daddy, thank you for always taking care of me," Pedro said, his childlike voice resonating like a nostalgic melody, full of love and simplicity. With every word little Pedro uttered, Don Andres felt a mix of emotions wash over him. Pride was inevitable, but there was also a pang of guilt he couldn't ignore. Responsibilities and business had always been like a chasm between him and his son, and now, on that lonely dawn, he wondered if he'd done enough. Was I really there for him? He thought, his eyes welling up, reflecting the blue light from the screen. The room seemed colder, the polished wood of the bookshelves absorbing the sadness that hung in the air. Don Andres leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to be transported back to a simpler time, when Pedro's presence brightened his days. But now, with his heir's fate so uncertain, every happy memory was tinged with the shadow of what could be an irreparable loss. The video continued, and Pedro, with the sincerity typical of children, talked about how he wanted to be like his father when he grew up, strong, protective, and admired by everyone. Don Andres felt a single tear escape, slowly sliding down his cheek before disappearing into the collar of his shirt. He had always wanted to be a role model, but now, caught between difficult choices and silent regrets, he questioned his own actions. As the video ended, the screen went black, but Pedro's words continued to echo in Don Andres's mind. He knew he needed to be strong, not only for his son, but for himself. Doubt still haunted him like a persistent ghost, but in that moment, he vowed to do everything in his power to save Pedro, not only out of paternal obligation, but out of the love he felt, that love that, even without words, was always there, unwavering. When he finally got up, the first rays of sunlight were already peeking through the gaps in the heavy curtains. Don Andres took a deep breath, feeling renewed determination warm his chest. He knew time was short, that every lost moment could be crucial, but he was determined to fight. With one last look at the now inert screen, he left the office, prepared to face whatever challenge the dawn might bring, his heart guided by hope and the silent promise of a future that could still be salvaged. In the stillness of the gathering morning, Don Andres's mansion vibrated with an almost palpable tension. The air was thick, charged with expectation and hope, mingled with the sweet, herbal aroma that seemed to emanate from the small room where Marisa took refuge with her herbs. There, the morning sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting wavy patterns across the polished wood floor. The room, which usually exuded a homely calm, was now the stage for a silent battle between science and mysticism, between despair and faith. Don Andres, after a sleepless night, felt every muscle in his body tense, as if an invisible weight pressed down on his shoulders. As he entered the room, the subtle sound of leaves being crushed in a stone mortar reminded him of the fragility of human life. His eyes, tired but resolute, met Marisa's, whose serene and confident expression was a safe haven amid the internal storm he faced. The old maid, an almost maternal figure in his life, had a presence that radiated an unshakable stillness, a stark contrast to the turmoil seething within him. "Don Andres," Marisa began, her voice soft but firm, "I know this all seems almost impossible. But there are things beyond what we can see or understand." She held out her hand, revealing the amber liquid that glowed with its own light, contained in a small glass bottle. "This medicine is my grandmother's legacy, passed down from generation to generation. I don't promise miracles, but I promise to do everything in my power." Don Andres's heart pounded hard, almost painfully, as if each beat were a reminder of the time slipping through his fingers. He looked at Marisa, the woman he had known since childhood, who had cared for him and was now there to care for his son. The dilemma between trusting conventional medicine and surrendering to ancestral wisdom consumed his mind. Yet, deep within him, a voice whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, the answer lay in the simplicity of what he had long despised. "Marisa, I trust you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. This statement, though simple, carried the weight of a lifetime of belief and doubt, becoming an act of pure faith. He approached the bed where Pedro, so frail and silent, lay like a small flame about to die out. The sight of his son, pale and motionless, gripped his heart with overwhelming pain. Marisa, with the dexterity of someone who had done this countless times, administered the medicine, murmuring words of gratitude and hope in her native tongue, a nearly forgotten song from ancient times. Don Andres watched every movement, every gesture, with anxious reverence. As the mixture slid down Pedro's throat, he felt as if the entire universe were contained in that moment, waiting, breathing with him. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Marisa remained beside Pedro, while Don Andres, unable to look away, clung to hope like a castaway to a plank. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, until the slightest sign of change, a deeper breath from Pedro, or a slight movement of his fingers, could mark the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. At that moment, Don Andres realized that the true miracle might not lie solely in Pedro's physical healing, but also in the renewal of his own faith, in the discovery that the answers he sought could reside in the most unexpected places. And so, enveloped in anxiety and hope, he waited, prepared to embrace whatever fate had in store for him. Marisa's words, imbued with ancient wisdom, echoed in his mind as he, in an act of silent devotion, prayed that that day would bring the redemption he so longed for. The silence in the mansion was almost palpable, like a dense fog seeping through the walls, enveloping every corner and every soul within. Tension was an invisible presence, an electric current that made the hairs on the back of the neck stand on end as the minutes passed with agonizing slowness. In the main living room, the dark wood furniture seemed to absorb the anxiety of the room, and the heavy, opulent velvet curtains muffled any sound that dared to disrupt the sacred silence. Don Andres stood by the window, his erect posture belying the storm of uncertainty raging within him. Did Marisa really have the answer? What if it was all just a desperate illusion? His thoughts were in turmoil, and he barely noticed when Evandro, with his feline gait, entered the room. Evandro, always impeccably dressed, exuded an almost supernatural confidence. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the room, searching for the best moment to launch his attack. "Don Andres, my dear friend." Evandro began, his voice soft and seductive as a siren song. "I cannot help but express my concern. This situation with Marisa, don't you think it's just another distraction? An excuse to prolong the suffering of all of us?" He paused dramatically, allowing his words to resonate, as a barely perceptible smile played across his lips. "We need concrete action, rational solutions, not superstition or false hope." Don Andres turned slowly to face Evandro, his eyes reflecting a mixture of doubt and defiance. "And what do you suggest, Evandro? That we give up? That we abandon all hope?" His voice was a hoarse murmur, thick with emotion. Each word was a battle, an effort to maintain his composure in the face of the storm that threatened to shatter his facade. Evandro leaned in a little closer, like a predator smelling its prey. "It's not about giving up, but being realistic. Marisa has no training, no medical knowledge. What can she offer, other than more pain and delay?" Just then, the classroom door opened slightly, and Marisa appeared, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her eyes, filled with determination and surprising calm, met Andres's. "I can offer hope, Evandro. And that, sometimes, is what keeps the flame of life burning." The clash of glances was intense. Evandro, with his wry smile, and Marisa, with the serenity of someone who trusts in something greater. Deep down, a question lingered: who would be right? As the tension continued to mount, the charged atmosphere promised that the outcome would be much more than a simple resolution. At every turn, Pedro's fate seemed to hang in the balance, and Evandro's words, rather than soothing, only fanned the flames of uncertainty even further. The entire mansion seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when the truth would come to light, revealing the fate that awaited them all. Inside the dimly lit room, the air was thick with a dense, almost palpable tension. The silence was broken only by the intermittent sound of the heart monitor, an auditory testament to the fragile line between life and death. Marisa stood beside Pedro's bed, her gaze fixed on the heir's pale face. Evandro, a few steps away, wore an expression of skepticism mixed with anxiety, while the other occupants of the room, Roberto, Sofia, and Helena, watched with a mixture of hope and despair. The atmosphere seemed to vibrate with an invisible energy, an electric current of anticipation. Marisa, with her wrinkled but firm hands, gently touched Pedro's forehead, feeling the feverish heat that still emanated from him. In her heart, a whispered prayer resounded, full of faith and determination. "Please, God, let him wake up, let him win this battle." Suddenly, an almost imperceptible movement altered the scene. Pedro's eyelashes fluttered, as if freeing themselves from a deep, heavy sleep. The small gesture didn't go unnoticed by Marisa, whose heart leaped in her chest like a bird finally freed from its cage. Her eyes filled with tears of relief and hope. He moved." Marisa exclaimed, her voice choked with emotion. Roberto, who had been leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, abruptly uncrossed them, his disbelief turning into a faint glimmer of hope. Sophia, clutching Helena's hand, took a deep breath, her wide eyes reflecting the dim light coming through the window. Evandro, still hesitant, moved closer to the bed, his expression of disbelief beginning to give way to a kind of reluctant admiration. It could just be a spasm. He tried to argue, but his voice no longer held the certainty it once had. There was a clear vulnerability in his tone, a crack in his armor of skepticism. But before anyone could respond, Pedro shook his head again, this time with more determination. His eyes, still heavy and bleary, slowly opened, revealing pupils that sought focus amid the dissipating fog. "Marisa," he murmured, his voice hoarse and weak, but full of life. It was a sound that resonated like music to those present, a miracle in the form of words. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. Sophia sobbed, tightening her grip on Helena's hand, while Roberto ran his hand through his hair, trying to process what he was seeing. Evandro, for his part, took a step back, as if struck by an invisible force, his eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and awe. Marisa, her heart overflowing with gratitude, clasped Pedro's hand in hers, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that needed no words. "I'm here, Pedro. I'm here," she assured him, her voice a steely edge coated with tenderness. The moment was transcendent, living proof that hope could indeed defy the impossible. The mansion, once shrouded in shadows of despair, now seemed illuminated by a new dawn, as Marisa, the humble maid with a healing secret, became an unexpected pillar of strength and faith. And as the scene unfolded, a thought lingered over everyone in the room: if Pedro could recover, what other surprises did fate have in store? Doubt, once a looming specter, now transformed into a promise of endless possibilities. The silence in the room was almost palpable, like a heavy blanket of anticipation enveloping each person present. The gentle ticking of the antique wall clock seemed to mark the rhythm of anxious hearts, while the golden rays of the setting sun lazily streamed through the mansion's enormous windows, tinting everything a warm orange hue. The scent of fresh flowers arranged in a crystal vase on the coffee table mingled with the woody scent of the room, creating an atmosphere that had been stifling in the recent past but now seemed to vibrate with new life. Don Andres, the family patriarch, stood slightly apart from the group, his calloused, trembling hands tightly gripping the ebony cane that always accompanied him. A man of imposing presence, his graying hair and piercing eyes bore witness to a life of challenges and achievements. Yet, at that moment, there was something different about his posture. His usual rigidity had given way to a vulnerability few had the privilege of witnessing. In his mind, images of the past few days danced like a slow-motion film, bringing forth a torrent of emotions he struggled to control. He looked at Marisa, the maid who, with her unshakable calm and quiet determination, had accomplished the impossible. She was there, beside Pedro, holding his hand with the same firmness and gentleness that only true guardians possess. Her eyes, as deep as the ocean, reflected a serenity that seemed to say everything was fine, that all the suffering had a greater purpose. And it was in that look that Don Andres found the courage to take the next step. With a deep sigh, heavy with years of pride and prejudice, he approached Marisa. The words stubbornly escaped, trapped in his throat like prisoners in a steel fortress. But he knew he needed to say it, needed to free himself from the burden that oppressed him. "Marisa," he began, his voice hoarse but determined. I was a fool." His eyes met hers, and in that silent contact, he saw the strength of a woman who never bowed to adversity. "I didn't believe you, even when you gave me every reason to believe," he continued, every word a battle against pride, every pause a sigh of regret. I was blinded by my own arrogance. I apologize, Marisa. Not just for Pedro, but for not seeing who you really are." Marisa, always discreet, gave a soft smile, but her eyes shone like two stars capturing the light of the universe. She needed no words to express the forgiveness she had already granted from the depths of her generous heart. However, she knew this was an important moment for Don Andres, a turning point that could change not only his relationship with her, but also the family dynamic as a whole. "Don Andres," she said, her voice as soft as the morning breeze. "Forgiveness is not a burden, but a gift. And it was already given, even before you asked." Her answer was an anchor cast into a sea of uncertainty, a promise that trust could be restored, that scars, however deep, could transform into marks of learning and growth. The patriarch nodded, his heart lighter, his soul calmer. He felt that, somehow, the unspoken words between them had created a new bond, a connection that would transcend time and space. In that moment, the mansion was no longer just a physical space, but a living, breathing entity, brimming with hope and unexplored possibilities. And as the sun set, tinting the sky pink and gold, Don Andres felt that perhaps the true miracle was not just Pedro's recovery, but the renewal of his own faith in goodness and the human capacity for change. And so, as night began to fall, the stage was set for the next act of this intricate drama, leaving in the air the promise that new developments were to come, that each character still had much to reveal, and that the future, uncertain and wonderful, was just waiting to be lived. The morning unfolded with an air of expectation and tension, shrouded in a mist that seemed to carry the whispers of long-kept secrets. In the town's central square, where the gentle breeze made the leaves dance with an almost melancholic grace, a crowd began to gather. There was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air, as if fate itself were about to unfold its cards on the table of life. Evandro, with his impeccably tailored suit and an almost arrogant confidence etched on his face, walked amidst the curious gazes and quiet whispers of the crowd. He had always considered himself untouchable, a man of power and influence, capable of shaping reality according to his greedy desires. But that day, fate had other plans. The voice of Clara, one of the family's former maids, rang out clear and firm, cutting through the air like a sharp blade. "Enough lies, Evandro. Everyone needs to know what you did." Her declaration reverberated through the square like thunder, and all eyes turned to her, while Evandro felt his blood run cold. Clara, until then a discreet and almost invisible figure, emerged as the unexpected heroine of this drama. The documents she held trembled slightly in her hands, but her resolve was unwavering. Each sheet was irrefutable proof of Evandro's fraudulent schemes, of his manipulations and betrayals that had damaged so many lives. The silence that followed was deafening, charged with silent judgment. Evandro tried to smile, a smile that was more like a grimace, trying to maintain his composure. But inside, his world was falling apart. How did she get this evidence, he thought, as a cold bead of sweat trickled down his temple. He couldn't believe his carefully built empire was crumbling before his eyes, exposed by a woman he had once considered insignificant. The murmurs began to grow, a wave of indignation and derision that surrounded him like a raging sea. Roberto, one of the town's merchants, raised his voice. "You robbed us, Evandro. You pretended to be our friend while stabbing us in the back." The accusation was a direct blow, and Evandro felt as if the ground were about to give way beneath his feet. Desperately, he looked around for support, an ally amidst that sea of accusing faces. But he found only coldness and disdain, for everyone there had, in some way, been his victims. "I have to get out of here," he thought, feeling the pressure build in his chest, an invisible prison slowly closing in. But before he could react, Laura, a young woman he had promised a bright future to only to destroy it, approached him with tears in her eyes but an unwavering firmness in her voice. "You must pay for all this, Evandro. It's the least you deserve." Her words were a sentence, and the crowd nodded in unison. Feeling cornered, Evandro took a step back, reality drowning him in despair. The weight of his actions finally crushed him, and he knew there was no escaping the consequences. With one last panicked look, he turned abruptly, fleeing down the cobblestone street like a defeated man, while behind him, the echo of his ruin reverberated in laughter and cries for justice. And so, under the watchful eye of a city finally finding its voice, Evandro became a shadow of the man he had once believed invincible. The square, witness to that decisive moment, pulsed with a new energy, a sense of justice and renewal. And as Evandro disappeared over the horizon, the sun rose, casting its light on a new day, a new beginning for all he had left behind. The Santoro mansion, with its imposing white columns and meticulously manicured gardens, glowed in the golden afternoon light, as if the universe itself were celebrating Pedro's unexpected recovery. The air carried the sweet scent of newly bloomed flowers, while the distant chirping of birds announced the arrival of a new era for the family. Inside the house, in the main hall, the family members gathered, their expressions relaxed for the first time in weeks of anguish. Don Andres, the patriarch, stood, his expression a mixture of relief and gratitude. His normally stern eyes shone with a new tenderness as he regarded Marisa, the woman who had changed his grandson's destiny. He approached her, his firm footsteps echoing on the marble floor, each step a testament to his irrevocable decision. "Marisa," he began, his voice firm, but with a gentleness that surprised even himself, "you brought light back to our home when all seemed lost." Marisa, still stunned by this turn of events, looked at Don Andres, her eyes reflecting a mixture of humility and disbelief. She could hardly believe that her former position as a maid had now transformed into something beyond her wildest dreams. "I only did what my heart told me, sir," she replied, her voice thick with sincerity and emotion. "Pedro is special to me, as if he were my own son." The room was silent, Marisa's every word resonating in the hearts of those present. The other family members, including Clara, Don Andres' daughter, and Roberto, her husband, watched the scene with teary eyes, recognizing the profoundness of the moment. Pedro, the boy who had once been on the brink of death, played happily on the carpet, his laughter a melody that filled every corner of the room. Don Andres took a deep breath, his next words carrying the weight of a new promise. "Marisa, we want you to become part of our family. Not just as Pedro's savior, but as someone we love and respect deeply." The words came out with a solemnity that made Marisa's heart leap in her chest. She hesitated for a moment, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. "I would be honored, sir." "Don Andres," she corrected herself, smiling shyly. With that invitation, the barriers that once separated the worlds of Marisa and the Santoro family began to dissolve. The relationship that had previously been defined by hierarchies transformed into something genuine and precious. As the other family members approached, enveloping Marisa in warm hugs and words of welcome, the atmosphere in the room was thick with love and renewal. Pedro, noticing the happiness around him, ran to Marisa, clinging to her hand with the innocence of a child who didn't fully understand the magnitude of what was happening, but felt the security and love emanating from her. "Aunt Marisa, will you stay with us forever?" he asked, his eyes wide and hopeful. Marisa knelt beside the boy, wrapping him in a hug that spoke louder than any words. "Yes, my dear, forever," she whispered, feeling the warmth of his small hand on her face, as if sealing a pact with destiny. The scene, marked by smiles, tears of joy, and sincere hugs, seemed frozen in time, a moment no one present would forget. And with the sun finally setting on the horizon, tinting the sky pink and gold, the harmony that seemed impossible so recently now reigned supreme in the Santoro mansion. Deep in their minds, everyone knew that new challenges would come, but now, as a true family, they were ready to face them together. And so, under the watchful eye of a future that promised new stories, gratitude and love blossomed, rooted in the bonds that had been forged on that unforgettable day. If you are moved by this story, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and comment below on what you liked most. Your opinion is very important to us. Share this video with someone who needs an inspiring story. Until next time,